in 11. The number and percentage of primary schools providing a language program. Well, obviously, you'd have to say language teaching is in a crisis throughout Australia. Victoria's in the best position. If you look at the number of students studying a language at the BC level in Victoria, it's about 18%. You go to Queensland, 6%, WA, exactly the same. But the situation's not healthy in Victoria. So if you look at the first column, in 2004, you had 86.9%, and that has dropped to 69.3%. So that's a serious decline. If you look at the number of primary schools offering the 8 most widely language studies, Italian is at the top, followed by Indonesian, followed by Japanese, and then French, German, Chinese, Greek. Now these figures will change at the secondary level. Have a look in particular at the figures for Chinese at the primary level, vastly outnumbered by the other languages at the top. Okay, the primary enrolments for the 6 most studied languages, once again, with the exception of the 2 bottom ones, there's a steady decline, with Italian, with Japanese and Indonesian in particular. There has been a dramatic drop, and the slight increase is the orange line down the bottom for Mandarin for Chinese. Or if you, in terms of the pie chart, that's at the primary level. So Italian is the largest, and then Japanese, Indonesian, and then all the others. Now let's have a look at the secondary level. The drop has not been as dramatic. Generally a little bit lower, 96.4 in 2004, down to 86.6. Steady decline. And similarly with the percentage of secondary college students studying the language over that period. But the secondary enrolments of the 6 most widely studied languages at the secondary level, you'll notice that French is the highest. French is the highest, followed by Italian and Japanese, and the blue one is Indonesian. So Indonesian has got the biggest drop over the years. And then German there. Chinese, slight increase, but mostly increase in Chinese classes happens with private providers, community language schools. The pie chart, once again, the same information. Japanese very high, Indonesian, Italian, French, German, the biggest ones. So if you want the tables, just very briefly. Italian, steady decline. Japanese, steady decline. Indonesian, dramatic decline since, especially since the 2002 incident that happened in Bali. So that is still a serious problem, because Education Department will not allow school children to go to Indonesia, right? Nor will they allow teachers on formal education business. French, very good. The French, in my view, my humble view, have got the French teachers are teaching the language for students from a non-French background. Not every language group is able to do that, and so they pitch the language for non-French background speakers. German, similar trend. Chinese on the way up, obviously. Over the page. Greek fairly steady. Spanish is one of the European languages which is on the increase. And I think the Consul-General's got it, and his team got to take some of the credit for this, because they have introduced a number of initiatives, whether it's the Cervantes Institute, teacher assistants, etc., that should be copied by other consulates and other ministries of education in Europe. Korean fairly steady, but it's not. It's still, I think, well, it's not increasing. And then Arabic, well, there's a lot of potential because the Arabic speakers in Victoria, the number of Arabic speakers in Victoria are quite significant. Turkey's doing a lot of work in this, so they're maintaining their numbers. Vietnamese originally was going to be introduced in schools, but that has stopped. Okay, very quickly, just to student enrolments in distance education, we'll skip that. Now, next one, 24. Australia, apart from the national curriculum, Australia already has in place an examination system for a whole range of languages. So the various boards of studies get together and they administer this particular system. And obviously, government language schools make a great contribution. I want to talk about the benefits of cooperation. Okay, two last slides. Loss of VC accreditation for European languages. Started in the 1990s with a couple of Eastern European languages, Slovak, Estonian and Czech. In 2006, Czech, Latvian, Lithuanian and Slovenian lost their accreditation. This year will be the last year Albanian can be studied at the Year 12 level. Romanian, I think, is about to lose it, but we'll wait for the VCAA to make the final decision. And Dutch, Maltese, Hungarian, Ukrainian, Swedish, all under threat. Once the student enrolments drops below 15 at the Year 12 level for 3 years in a row, they're gone. What that happens is that the student enrolments drop at all other levels below VC because students say, why should I study it when I can study history or some other subject and get accreditation? And so the challenges to the future of teaching, well, I think the immigrants who came to Melbourne in the post-World War II period, they're ageing. Families are no longer concentrated in the same suburbs, and so when students move from one school where the language is taught to another, the language may not be offered. Students of the third generation find it harder to retain their background language. The assimilation factor is strong. Then there are other factors, timetable clashes in schools or principals who don't approve of language studies. And I think, as far as European languages, obviously the tyranny of distance, it is a factor. If you grow up in Paris and you want to study German, get on the train and go next door. So, okay, what needs to be done? Finally, I think we need to convince the Australian community of the importance of studying another language. We need to get the balance right. Asian languages are on the rise, but it doesn't mean that we get that the battle, the argument is lost, because Asian languages, especially the character languages, are much harder to teach. The teachers are not there at the moment. Secondly, you cannot study Chinese for 1 hour a week. If you're going to study Chinese, you've got to do it seriously. And then schools have got budgets. I think now's the time to strengthen middle-sized languages like Polish, Croatian, Russian, Serbian, etc. And this is where you need the consulates and overseas Ministry of Education to get involved, establish teacher assistant programs, send lecturers to Victoria to provide training to the teachers, encourage and facilitate teachers from Victoria, students of Victoria, to go to Europe and do some additional studies. Send the latest textbooks as a European language as a second language. Establish distance education programs to cover students who don't live in the metropolitan areas, who live in rural schools, and especially with online language courses. Everyone around Australia can assess them, and of course funding of some sort. I'll leave it at that.
For providing us with these very telling figures. Pascaline, may I ask you?
Yes, well, I guess what I'm going to tell you ties in very well with what you have just told us, but it's from a different angle. It's at the university level. And so I'm going to talk about the role of education, but again at the university level, in conveying a certain image of Europe and the EU in Australia, and particularly of initiatives of the EU in partnership with Australian universities. And I'll try to keep to the time. It's going to be tough, but all right. I guess if you look at what Australian universities have been trying to do, you can do so in several ways. You can look at EU centers or European centers in Australian universities. You can also try to understand the ties with certain institutes such as the European University Institute in Florence. You can talk about CISA, you can talk about Jean Monnet chairs, and so I'm going to try to do all of this, and I have like 15 to 20 minutes, so I'll try to be brief here. If you look at the first European studies courses, for instance in the 60s or the 70s or even in the 80s, you see that they have a strong humanities bias. So they mainly consisted of languages and history. So this has evolved over time, and I would like to give you perhaps one example of a European Studies Center. It's the one I know best because I was allowed to interview some of the protagonists and so on, and I'm also the director of one of his latest Avatar, but he didn't know start with me or anything like this. So I'm going to talk about the Monash Center for European Studies, which was established in 1987, and it was created by specialists in French and German literature. They were keen to engage in interdisciplinary work and to expand the scope of French and German studies and languages. There were also historians involved, and to a lesser extent, political scientists. The Vice Chancellor provided funding. The Dean of Arts also provided funding at the time. And interestingly enough, this is also a constant, a common point with other centers, in Victoria and elsewhere that saw the light of day around the same time. Many of the initiators of the center were born in Europe or had studied there and traveled back regularly for research. So there's always this European element. And at the time, those who started the center watched as momentous changes on the eastern fringe of Europe, such as glasnost, ebbed at the end of the Cold War, and as European communities moved towards the completion of a single market. And some were concerned with the turn towards Asia in Australian politics and universities, and felt that action was needed to keep European languages and the study of Europe on the map. So they stepped beyond their own research areas and sought to create a solid teaching program in European studies, which would give students majoring in European languages a competitive edge in the labor market by identifying them as European specialists. So this led to the creation of master programs in modern European studies and medieval and Renaissance European studies by the Monash Center. The Monash Center also liaised with the EC to become a documentation center of the EC. Then a core subject for first-year undergraduates entitled Contemporary Europe was created, and that focused in part on the EC, but also on the Comic-Con. So there were the two sides. Interestingly enough, we reintroduced this recently, and Eva knows this very well, and she teaches it. So we came back to our roots, and thought this was a way to teach Europe and also the EU. The Master in Modern European Studies included at the time a compulsory subject on the EC. There were conferences, publications, and so on and so on. And now I come to the EUI connection, the European University Institute. It was very interesting for me to discover this because actually I taught at the European University Institute before coming to Australia, so it all came into place. So let me explain. So in early 1988, in order to celebrate the Australian bicentennial, the European Commission, via its delegation in Canberra, advertised fellowship to the European University Institute in Florence for the academic year 1988-1989, and 3 fellows were selected. 2 were from Sydney and 1 from Melbourne. And the one from Melbourne was Peter Howard, who was a PhD candidate at Monash University. Now, it was, of course, an exciting time to be in Europe on the cusp of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in the early 1990s, then he came back to the EUI for months, and Professor Stuart Wolff, a renowned historian at the EUI and the University of Essex, came to Monash and gave presentations at the Center for European Studies. He was interested in supervising Australian students, and he was instrumental in the EUI's approach to Peter Howard in June 1995 to set up a foundation to allow Australian fellows to come to the European University Institute. So this led to the creation of the Australian European University Institute Fellowships Association Incorporated. It's a long name, but in 1996. And it's a consortium of Australian universities which contribute to funding fellowship to the EUI based on merit. And it still exists to this day. So don't forget, those in this room that might be interested to go to Italy, the European University Institute still exists. You can apply for these fellowships every year. And it's very, very nice, very interesting to be at the European University Institute. Now I come to another link, to try to explain this kind of network, trying to teach Europe and the EU. And I'm going to talk briefly about CESA, the Contemporary European Studies Association of Australia. And there the background also ties in actually with the European University Institute. So that's why it's interesting to see this link with Italy. Now, if there are questions about how the European University Institute is funded, I'd be glad to explain later on. It's funded partly by the European Union, but also by the member states, which is quite interesting. So also around the 90s, a young Irish ex-diplomat who had just completed her PhD at the European University Institute was appointed as a lecturer in European politics at the University of Melbourne, so we're now in 1989. She had previously worked at the Irish Embassy in Paris, and you know who I'm talking about, Philomena Murray. I think Sophie here is doing her PhD with her, right? When she arrived in Australia, she noticed two things. First of all, there was a lot of antagonism at official level towards the European communities, a lot of talk about the horrible CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, and there seemed to be also a lack of knowledge about the EC in Australia. So she decided to introduce an undergraduate subject entitled European Integration, the Politics of the European Union. So that was in 1991. At the same time, she set out to create CESA, so the Contemporary European Studies Association of Australia, and so created a network around academic, not just in Victoria, but much beyond that. CESA didn't have a lot of money. I mean, it operated, on the goodwill of the people involved, but it also had the sympathy, among others, many sympathies, but of DFAT, in fact, that sent speakers and so on and so on. So these were difficult times, but a lot of enthusiasm compensated for the lack of funding. Then we come to the 1990s. The 1990s were interesting, where there were a flurry of bilateral agreements signed between the EC and Australia, including a wine agreement and so on. But at the same time, Australian policymakers continued to underestimate economic opportunities in the EU, and there was also a significant trade deficit with the EU. And in education, there was an emphasis on the part of the Australian government on Asian languages. So in 1994, this was the time of the Rudd report on Asian languages and Australia's economic future, and there was an intention to definitely boost Australian export by improving the knowledge of Asian cultures and languages in Australia, thereby making Australians more Asia literate. So this led to a reaction of the Europeanists in Australia who wondered how best to lobby for European studies, as you would expect. On the perhaps positive side, from the point of view of the Europeanists, many universities in Australia were teaching European subjects in the early 1990s. Not all, however, taught EC or EU subject. And while European universities had specialized postgraduate courses on European integration, Australia lacked similar programs. So towards the end of the 1990s, Heather Field, a senior lecturer in European Studies at Griffith University, commented on the difficult situation of European studies in Australia. She said that there was a drop-off in interest in European languages in third-generation immigrant communities, coupled with budget cuts in universities, and that this all had led to, I quote, a growing lack of language skills among staff and students, and that this threatens some of the most recently established initiatives in teaching European integration rather than traditional and well-entrenched ones. And the rise of Asian studies from virtually nothing in the early 70s had also tended to crowd out the study of Europe and other areas, with, as a result, she said, very limited opportunities for EU specialists compared to those in Asian studies. EU and Europe specialists, consequently, were leaving Australia and were not being replaced. So what was going to be done about this? Well, by the end of the decade, a group of Europeans held a workshop at the Australian National University in Canberra. And, well, you know, they just compared notes and basically concurred that the situation of European studies in Australia was rather gloomy. And so what they sought to do is to emulate the strategies followed by the Asianists in their successful lobbying of government for support and provision of educational language and other programs in order to make Australia, Asia literate. Okay, let me just skip some things. So now let's look at the EU centers. We've looked at European centers. Well, guess what? The EU itself has been active, you know, in trying to improve, I guess, knowledge of Europe and the EU in Australia. So if you look at the beginning of the 21st century now, you see increased funding from the EU to support European studies in various parts of the world. How did this all start, this EU center? Well, I learned some of this, more of the background recently at the conference, actually. In 1998, in response to a proposal from the European Parliament, the European Commission launched a call for proposal to establish EU centers in the United States. But how did the European Parliament get the idea? That's where it gets interesting. It's actually a professor from the University of Pittsburgh, who I know very well, who suggested this to parliamentarians. So, and who then later on got the EU Center. So that gets even more interesting. So this is the true background to this. It was the idea of an academic. So that's the background. So by 2001, the initiative was extended to Australia and New Zealand, and I've just been recently to a conference of EU centers in Brussels. Quite interesting. There are now many more such centers throughout the world. So how is it intended to function in Australia and New Zealand? But there was supposed to be just one EU center in Australia and one EU center in New Zealand. What were they supposed to do? Well, they were supposed to promote academic excellence and also to enlarge the community of Europeanists to many other disciplines than the ones that were currently interested, in European studies. And that was supposed to attract sponsorship to fund research and teaching on contemporary Europe, while also helping to improve relations between the EU and Australia. This is key to the end, I promise. In 2004, it was time to take stock, and there are independent evaluators who look at the centers, and everybody in the center struggles when they come when trying to look really, really good. But they basically said, okay, very good on policy-oriented research, but there is a very low number of PhD students, not enough, linkages with business. But they also said, well, maybe it's unfair to ask a center located in Canberra to liaise with business. So maybe we should have one in Melbourne and maybe in Sydney. The result was that two centers were funded in Melbourne, one of which is the Monash European EU Centre. Another one was a consortium at the University of La Trobe, which was actually a network of universities. I can't go into all of the details here. In 2009, funding for my center was renewed, and another center was also established at RMIT, and I see one of the representatives here. If you summarize now, if you look at all of the different EU centers, you see that they have so far included universities in 3 important academic networks in Australia: the Group of 8, so that's Monash, the Innovative Research Universities, and the Australian Technology Network. Now, from the point of view of the Commission of the EU, why these EU centers being funded? Well, that's because they're seen as being, as universities are being seen as being excellent multipliers, which train students who then go on to become opinion leaders and decision makers educated on the EU. And this ensures that in-depth sustainable knowledge about the EU is imparted among a wide range of stakeholders across Australia. It's a way for the EU also to encourage the transmission of a more balanced image of the EU via an actor in the university that does not appear to convey the official EU view in the way its delegation does. So there have been several calls for proposal. We're expecting the next one next year. And more the focus has been away from just focusing on languages and history, going beyond that. It has been on focusing on the EU, as a more unified actor. More and more emphasis also on outreach, and there's going to be even more emphasis in the next call on outreach. And then I hear is very busy with that aspect, and it's very time-consuming. So that was for EU centers. And one last word, and I will stop, about Jean Monnet chairs. Jean Monnet chairs are a bit different. So for the EU centers, the evaluators basically come from EU institutions. For the Jean Monnet chairs, they come from EU institutions, but also from universities. So the selection of the Jean Monnet chair is done by independent peer review. Now the Jean Monnet chair does not have, Jean Monnet chair action doesn't have as much money. It comes from a different part of the European Commission than the EU centers funding. But in spite of the fact that they don't have a lot of money, they have prestige. And so there are a lot of Jean Monnet actions, chairs in the world, and I think this has been rather successful. Now, a note to try to evaluate all this. There's a lot more that I don't talk about. These are graphs and all kinds of nice things. So one, there is actually a chapter on this which I can send you. What we can see since I guess from 1993 onwards, we've made a survey, is a clear progression. There's more and more subjects being taught that include an EU aspect, more subjects also being taught specifically on the European Union. Not so many, I would say, specialized programs focusing only on the European Union. I think that's something that would work in Europe, perhaps not as much here in Australia. So on the whole, a rather successful story. It's not all beautiful and rosy, however. And I would have to say that one of my personal problems is that the reporting requirements are huge. And there is a difficulty in trying to satisfy, I guess, an academic employer and also the requirements of the EU. And ultimately, I think that you need time to do all of this. So if you want to do good teaching, you need to be able to do good research. And if you are able to do good research, then you can communicate better. So all of this ties in together. Thank you very much.
Quick historical overview of the discipline of European studies here in Australia. We started late, and therefore I think we have a couple of minutes left for the discussion. I'm sure you have questions or comments on specific aspects of topics that were covered in the talks, or general questions.
I have a question for Mr. Merlino. Well, just as a background, I did my year 11 and 12 Italian at VSL in Box Hill. And do you think maybe one of the issues concerning the decline of languages would be at the primary school level? I remember, for example, Italian primary school classes would be like a 45-minute babysitting time for the teachers. Do you think maybe an option would be say, what immersion schools are doing with French and Japanese? Do you think that may be the potential area for improvement?
Well, clearly, students have to have good teachers at the primary level. There is a shortage of good language teachers in just about every language you can think of. And that happens when the principal says, "Oh, well, we've lost our Italian teacher has resigned. We got Sarah over there, or Charlie, and you know they went to Venice for 3 months, and they're really good, you know." You bring those sorts of people in, and the kids are wrecked for life. My view is, if you don't have good language teachers, don't teach a language at all. And so the supply of language teachers is at a low level, and that has to be increased. And you really need, a whole range of factors. You need to change community attitude. It's also influenced by the fact that my view, and I don't have the statistical information, but my view is that 98% of primary school teachers have not studied a language beyond the compulsory year 8, whatever. And so as a result, there's a lot of tokenism. So you teach, there are a lot of schools that have a language program, and they're very proud of it. How long do you teach it for? 45 minutes or 1 hour, And clearly, that wrecks the kids for life. You get a bad language teacher, the students are put off for life. So really, you need good leadership at the primary school level. You need good teachers. You need exciting programs. Concerts. The whole lot. School camps. The whole lot.
If I could just follow that topic, is there any cooperation between the language institutions, between your School of Languages and Goethe-Institut or Cervantes?
Well, that's done through our language teachers associations. So fortunately in Victoria we have we have the Modern Language Teachers Association, which is an umbrella body. Now within that you have the German Teachers Association, French teachers, Italian teachers, Indonesian teachers. And it relies on the professionalism of the teachers. And a number of our secondary, mainly secondary, most of our teachers are involved and do a lot of volunteer work through their teacher associations. And of course, the Goethe-Institut, the Dante Alighieri Society, etc. Alliance Française.
Yeah, I actually think there is a similarity between Europe and Australia, something that Europe and Australia can pick up on together maybe. It's the difference between perception and reality, because recent statistics from Europe also show that, like the multiculturalism, the multilingualism that the European Union wants to promote is actually not reality. So Europeans, they think, yes, Europe is a great multilingual place, but if you look at the number of people who actually speak other languages, more than one other language, it's very low. So that's very similar. And the other thing is that there is a trend going to Asian languages, also in Europe. So that's the perception. So it's the latest numbers of Eurostat. That there is actually a trend that people think might be better for my children to learn Chinese than other European languages. So that's probably something that both Australia and Europe need to look at.
I've come back from 2 weeks in Croatia where I visited a number of schools, both primary and secondary, and I can tell you I was very impressed, particularly by the primary schools. You have teachers there speak very good English, very good German, very good Italian. Amazing stuff. Never seen anything like that. So what you're saying would vary from one country to another. It would vary from the city to the countryside. There'd be a lot of factors involved. But quite clearly, I've been to Croatia twice. The skills shown by the schools. Even the chef for one who went to a hospitality school, he could communicate in 3 languages. A hospitality school in where I went, Paul, the students have got to study 3 languages. English, you know, and then depending what area, English, German, Italian, French, or whatever. And that's amazing. We have William Anglis Institute here in Melbourne. Do the students study any language at all? I don't think so.
That was another question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if that's connected somehow to the labour market, because obviously always you need, like, it's with languages, I've been looking for jobs around coming from Europe, speaking 3 languages, trying to advertise that skill. No one's really interested working in international business, because English is the language everyone speaks, so you don't really need German, you don't really need French, you don't really need maybe Spanish or Italian when you go into their markets, but not really if it's an international business, because they're all communicating in English. But everyone's looking for Mandarin speaking people or Hindi speaking, so I guess when you go to school, you always look to what's actually out there, and I don't find it very well advertised here from the business side, because they do actually benefit for people that do understand these cultures, because there's a total different way of negotiation if you do it in the mother tongue language of the people, the business people, for example. And I don't think there's or I don't experience a good advertisement for academic jobs in the European field, whereas there's probably the European Centre, but how many other area in academia are there that are actually concerned with Europe, culturally, politically, or language-wise? It's I just find sometimes there's a lack of knowledge about the opportunities that are out there.
Can I add something to that very quickly as well?
No, you, well, go.
So when I do my masters at the EU Centre in Pascaline, and one of our comparative regionalism classes, one of the students who studies politics, different regional groupings, said to me, "What has Europe contributed to? Like, what has the European Union contributed?" People just don't have a concept. Even people who study international relations and politics still don't know. That's what the EU Centre does. It's so fantastic. You learn things that you would never even heard of about the European Union before, but people don't know about it.
Is it useful?
Gentleman in the second row, please. Yes.
Oh, me? I've just come back from France, and I've been reading the European press, and I've been reading the Australian press, and as I landed back, the white paper on Asia landed on my breakfast table. In response to it, I stress a few people, I don't want to start a riot here, people have said, what is the point of learning Chinese or French or German? They all speak English. And the world, whether we like it or not, is going domestic language, English international language. I've just had 3 weeks in France battling to speak French, because every time I start speaking in French, my interlocutor starts speaking in English, because, quote, I want to learn English. So we have this hilarious situation where I'm speaking poor French, and they're speaking somewhat better but poor English. Are we not better, and I've heard a couple of people alluding to this, and this would be my experience working in Asia, are we not better to concentrate on teaching people cultures, about the cultural norms, about the nature and character of the civilization, than teaching languages? I'm horrified to see the range of languages up there. We are not going to change the community's attitudes. We should change to reflect what the community's needs. Have I ever worked in China or Singapore or Malaysia or India or France or Germany and felt a deep loss about language? Yes, only when I have to translate documents. Vast numbers of these people speak other languages. Why don't we stop worrying about languages and worry more about the culture and the politics?
May I pick up on this perhaps? Well, if I think of my own country of origin, which is Germany, I tell my students, well, Germany reached the targets, well, in regard to the implementation of renewable energies. Germany reached the targets set for 2020 by the end of 2011. If you want to understand this, then you need to study German Romanticism. There we are with the culture knowledge, but the medium for this is the German language, of course. So I think it's not possible to separate the languages and the cultures in that way.
It's a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking that you get from the language. That's why it's important.
But the thing is, I can only learn 1 or 2 languages, but I have to deal with 5 or 6 countries. Wouldn't I be better, as far as it goes, to study the culture and the social norms than I would to try and struggle through 6 languages? By the way, I'm horrified to see the Spanish is up there, with respect. The 3rd, one of the top 3 languages in the world. Anyway, no, I merely asked the question to raise the issue. Higher, because it was already raised.
Now, I think Australia really loses quite a lot of opportunities because there's a strong language base here in Australia. I mean, with those many immigrants, it's just a waste of resources on teaching language at all and keeping them up. And as you've heard, that 3rd generation Australians basically have lost their language of origin. I think you can't waste, you shouldn't waste it anymore. And I totally agree with Frank basically, is that principles are so important at the school level because as you've said, the older you get, the harder it is learning a language. If you start at primary level, you basically have it much easier learning a language than starting at the age of whatever, 34 or whatever you might think of. And the demand, I mean, I can only speak for the German side of it, but the demand for languages, they are there in Australia. I mean, our language courses are booming all the time, and I've just had a quick look at one of your slides. In terms of German and French, I think the numbers in distance education, they're really going up all through the roof, basically. And the reason for that is that these languages are not taught anymore in school. And really, I only see it's a waste of resources.
I think it's a lot harder for British-speaking countries to select the main language or languages to study. It's a lot harder for Australia because of our geographical location. Basically, European country, but nearest neighbour is Indonesia. So it is a lot more complex. And that's why you'll never get agreement of, in China, say everybody speaks English, that's it, and they go through the system. Australia, it's much more difficult. However, the links between language and culture are very intricate. So it depends on the degree of insight that individuals want to get into a special country. If you want to keep it at the superficial level, that's okay. And you can walk around with iPads and say, press it when you go to a shop, and it will translate good morning into bonjour. You can do all of that. But if you want to get inside the country, inside the character of the country, there's the old cliche. If you want to sell, if you want to buy cars from the Japanese, you speak in English. If you want to sell stuff to the Japanese, well, you got to get into their culture and the way of doing things, and it's about communication. So it depends on the degree of knowledge that you want to get out of a when you're visiting a country. So if you want to keep it at the superficial level, by all means speak English. But you're less likely to get ripped off by the taxi driver. You speak in the language.
Melissa, you want to?
I was just going to respond quickly on that issue around learning languages and culture. I think one thing I got very clearly from Frank's presentation is we have a problem with language learning in Australia. And I think it's partly because we have 3 quite different groups and we have to deal with them differently. So there's your group who might want to learn the language for heritage or cultural reasons, and as a vibrant multicultural country, we should support that. We should see that as part of what we do. Then you've got a group who might need it for their careers, and that, as Frank said, has always been a problem, working out what is the focused language we're going to choose. If you're in Brazil, say, everyone will start with English and then they might learn Spanish and then they might learn something else. It's never been that obvious for us, and you can see that in the selection of priority languages over time. That makes it really hard to work out what business career language you should learn is. But then I think the third group of people are people who are probably never going to use language in their careers, and that's just a reality. You know, they're going to be an electrician or something, and it's not going to be high on their list of priorities in life. But we may have a view as a society that we'd like people to be cultivated human beings, the same way they learn music, not because they're going to be a concert pianist, but because we think it's a good thing to have been exposed to. It might be in that area where more of the cultural teaching would actually be much more useful, I think, where you're saying, we don't expect that you're going to come out with fluency, but we'd like you to have some basic understanding of the cultures and culture. So I think there's some common ground there. But for what it's worth, if you're feeling as a European language speaker that you know, it's not being taken seriously in the workplace, Asian language speakers feel exactly the same. You know, and there's a general question of how languages are valued in Australia.
Yes, just if you could follow on from this lady's answers on those three different groups, I was interested in what's the rough proportion in these schools of these three different categories, and where in fact are the schools marketing, who are they really marketing to?
That's probably a
Look,
question.
in Victoria, schools have got a certain degree of autonomy. So the language selected by the school, basically it depends on their school community. The teachers have an input, the principal has an input. There are also links between, contacts between the primary school and the local high school. So really they have a choice. You know, the department will recommend whatever, you know, a number of languages. But then if there's a particular concentration of, for example, of Norwegian students, you know, in a particular area, they might, the school might offer Indonesian and Norwegian. So it's a complex, you know, and so you know, schools look at what the policies are, and then they make a choice. The parents have an input on the school council, and sometimes if a school drops a particular language, you know, the parents revolt and all that sort of thing.
But that may change with the implementation of the white paper. One of the things in the white paper on Australia in the Asian century is that students must be offered a choice of an Asian language. Of course, that's an implementation. That was promised for 2025. So we're not seeing it.
That's a primary level?
It says students must be offered, as in all students. But as I say, it's not until 2025 that needs to be negotiated with state governments and the rest. But that's at least the aspiration that's been put forward.
If I may, the answer Frank just gave is a brilliant example of what you're saying about a proportion of the school population learning languages for family cultural reasons. When I arrived in Australia far too long ago, the Greeks paid for their own kids to go to school on Saturday. Now we're asking the public to pay for a hodgepodge of languages to satisfy a cultural need, and so they can get a subject more easily in VCE. The beauty, at least, of the white paper is if we can implement a policy that focuses on the four languages, whatever they're going to be, and if parents want to teach cultural heritage to their kids, let them pay for it separately. But it's not part of public education.
You could say that the state will pay for it through things like Victorian School of Languages. Then you
Well,
say that
maybe.
heritage languages come in, you know, as a service to the community, but it's not so much what you're offered.
But we're not focusing. We're diffusing the money across such a broad base that we're achieving little.
The
We couldn't
VSL
achieve
allowed me to keep my culture alive. My sister studied Spanish and French. The VSL allowed me to go and do Italian. Allowed me to speak to my grandmother.
I'm sorry, my language is dead. Irish isn't very current.
And I think actually the course in your life usually changes. But the thing is, if you haven't started learning a language at early stage, that keeps you off languages anyway. So, because there are certain strategies connected to it once you learn it, and it's also got to do something with your brain and how your brain reacts to learning a language. And if you start something, for example, learning whatever Chinese, German, maybe French, or whatever it is, if you start at primary level, then you have much easier, even if you come to university, for example, and your interest is in whatever architecture, art, and you may find yourself wanting to learn some German or French or whatever, it makes it much easier later on in life. So,
may I perhaps touch on the title of this symposium today? It's Communicating Europe to Australia. Who is it actually who has to communicate what? Is it the Europeans that who should communicate their languages, their cultural heritage and so on to Australia through funding initiatives and whatever? Or is it actually the Australians to take initiative here and, well, to decide which focus they would like to choose? Yeah.
And if I may add to this, what exactly is Europe in Australia? Because from the papers, all the papers given here, it seems to me we're talking about two different Europes. One, Pascaline, you talked about integrated, existing like a country called Europe, while we have national representatives who are promoting their national cultures, and we've just come to a conclusion that identity resides in the language. We have to learn the language to understand the German. I am Polish, for example. Every time I start talking to a German, I run into trouble because we don't get one another. How, so maybe the question is to Melissa and the two national representatives, how do you think belonging to this greater Europe works for you? Does it enhance your position? Does it make it more difficult for you? What's it like? Because from the list of topics, for example, I could see that half of them were about national topics and half of them were something to do with the EU. And we also ask ambassadors, they come and talk about EU security policy, EU agriculture policy. They don't talk about Spanish, Belgian, or French policy on something. They talk about the EU. Well, this is what we have to do. This is why we exist. But how does it work for national representatives? Or is there tension, conflict? Is there?
I would say at this point, I mean, you're exactly right. We do both. We look at the EU as an international actor in a very interesting way, but we also look at each of the constituent members, and we have the diplomatic representatives of each of the members come and speak to us. So we do both of those, and we don't see any contradiction. We see them both as interesting actors in international affairs at different levels in different ways. I suppose the best example of that would be looking at the European External Action Service, happily coexisting with diplomatic corps of the various countries, and it's a little bit like that story. I don't think either overtax the other in that discourse.
What's it like in Spanish?
So, it's the question, or that brings up the question of whether we would have to rename your position from the chair in European integration to the chair in European disintegration, with the face of, well, what could be called the age of renationalization across
Can I ask one last thing that might segue into the next panel then, and to all panelists or the ones to answer, because one of the things to consider also is what sort of image do we in Australia have of Europe? And when you say Europe, it's like saying Africa almost, you know, because it's so different. So, but what is the image currently that Australians, thinking back to that cloud, you know, what does Europe even register beyond the debt crisis? You know, what image do we have? That would be interesting to hear, I think, from each of you or whoever.
Yeah, look, I think you're right. The crisis is certainly very big in people's minds.
But beyond that?
But beyond that, there's been some very interesting research done on Australian public opinion on Europe, which a couple of people will probably refer to, so I won't get into it too much. But yeah, there are a range of views. It depends on how you phrase the question. As I think people spoke about earlier, it used to be when you said Europe, what you meant was those terrible protections people could kick our homes out. You know, you had a very limited idea of what Europe was. Whereas if you asked about, I don't know, any one of the constituent states, you might get a whole different view. You know, oh, the French, they're like this, or the Germans are like this, but Europeans, oh, we mean Brussels, and we're annoyed at them. So, you know, those sort of things change over time. I think a lot of those views coexist, and a lot of it is pushed by the current crisis or issue, whatever it is, by the way that the question is framed. and people's views will be very much a push one.
I'm afraid we are all slaves to the time, and therefore we need to close this panel for now. Thanks to all who have contributed, be it as panelists or be it as contributors to the discussion. So thank you very much again.